In the quiet dawn of a city barely awake, two officers stumble upon a chance encounter with a limping puppy, a spark that would change everything. What begins as a simple act of compassion soon becomes a life-altering journey filled with loyalty, love, and an unexpected bond that would lead them to an astonishing discovery, leaving no heart untouched. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming an emotion that you won't want to miss. It was early morning, and the city was still waking up as Alejandro and Ricardo patrolled the quiet streets. In one of the dark alleys, something caught Alejandro's attention, a small brown puppy limping with an injured paw, shivering in the cold. The two officers exchanged glances, immediately understanding that the little creature needed help. Alejandro knelt down, extending his hand to the puppy, who hesitantly came closer. Despite his initial wariness, the puppy allowed Alejandro to gently pet him. His small, dirty tail moved slightly, as if sensing that Alejandro meant no harm. Alejandro murmured soft words of reassurance, trying to comfort the trembling puppy. "Hey, little one. Everything's going to be okay," he whispered, as the puppy rested his head on Alejandro's hand, seeking comfort and safety. Ricardo, who had been quietly watching, crossed his arms thoughtfully. "We can't leave him here," he remarked. "He looks lost, and who knows how long he's been out here with that injured paw." Alejandro nodded, knowing they had to help the puppy, who had now nestled closer to him. Without saying another word, Alejandro carefully scooped the puppy into his arms, handling him with care so as not to worsen his injury. The puppy looked up at Alejandro, a glimmer of hope and gratitude in his eyes. Despite the obvious pain, he seemed calmer, as if he somehow knew he was in good hands. "We'll take him to the shelter and see if they can treat him," Alejandro decided. "And maybe, who knows, we'll find his owner." As they continued their patrol, Alejandro held the puppy, whom they'd named Kilo after the street where they'd found him, close, keeping him safe and secure. Upon reaching the shelter, a veterinarian hurried to greet them, instantly noticing Kilo's injured paw. Alejandro explained how they had found him, emphasizing that he needed urgent care. "It looks like he's been like this for a few days, but it doesn't seem too serious," the veterinarian assured them, gently taking Kilo in her arms. The officers left Kilo in her care, hopeful that this would be the start of something better for the little puppy. As Kilo was treated, Ricardo had an idea: why don't we post about him on social media? Maybe someone will recognize him, or at least we could find him a temporary home. Alejandro, watching through the glass as Kilo was tended to, nodded in agreement. It seemed like a good way to connect Kilo with someone who might be looking for him or who would want to help. Ricardo took out his phone and quickly composed a heartfelt post. He attached a few photos of Kilo they had taken throughout the day, showing his tiny figure and soulful eyes. "We found this little guy while on patrol," he wrote. "He seems lost and hurt. For now, we're calling him Kilo. If anyone recognizes him or knows where he belongs, please reach out." The post was simple but powerful, and within minutes, it began to gain attention. At first, only a few likes and comments appeared, with people expressing their hope for Kilo's recovery and curiosity about his story. But as the hours passed, the post went viral. People from across the city began sharing it, and comments poured in from those touched by Kilo's plight. "What a sweet dog. I hope he finds a loving home," one commenter wrote. Another said, "Thank you, Alejandro, for taking care of him." As Alejandro checked his phone later, he was amazed to see the growing number of likes, shares, and heartfelt comments. He hadn't expected such a response, and the show of compassion from strangers moved him deeply. What had started as a simple post for help had become a wave of support and concern. People in the community seemed genuinely invested in Kilo's future, rooting for him to find a safe and loving home. Each new comment reminded Alejandro of how much people cared about Kilo, even those who had never met him. The story of a small, injured dog had touched a nerve, sparking empathy throughout the city. Alejandro found himself reading through each comment, feeling encouraged and warmed by the collective kindness, and realizing how one small act of compassion could resonate with so many. While Kilo became a familiar sight around the station, Alejandro couldn't ignore the feelings that his presence stirred. Since his wife's passing 3 years earlier, he had struggled to fill the emptiness in his life. His work as a police officer, with its demanding hours and difficult cases, only served to highlight the loneliness he felt each night when he returned to his empty home. Kilo, though small and vulnerable, seemed to bring a spark back into Alejandro's life. The simple companionship of having someone waiting for him brought an unexpected sense of comfort. As the days went by, Alejandro found himself looking forward to his time with Kilo, even if it was just a few moments stolen between shifts. The other officers noticed the change in Alejandro as well. Even those with tougher personalities stopped by to pet Kilo or toss him a ball of crumpled paper, finding joy in the puppy's eager response. "This dog is something special," remarked Martinez, a seasoned officer. "Look how he makes us all laugh, and he's only been here a few days." Alejandro smiled, watching Kilo dart around, chasing shadows on the station floor. Yet, amidst the laughter and newfound companionship, Alejandro couldn't shake a deeper connection he felt toward Kilo. He had recently discovered that Kilo hadn't just wandered off on his own, he had been abandoned. Something about that revelation hit Alejandro profoundly. It reminded him of his own feelings after his wife's death, as though life had moved on and left him behind. It was as if both he and Kilo knew what it felt like to be left alone, each in their own way. Alejandro, determined not to let his emotions cloud his judgment, reminded himself daily that he was simply looking out for the dog. But with each passing day, he realized that Kilo was doing more than just filling a void, he was helping Alejandro heal in ways he hadn't expected. As Alejandro continued to care for Kilo, he couldn't ignore the attachment that had grown between them. Each day, when he had to drop Kilo off at the shelter, he felt a pang of sadness, a sensation that lingered long after he left. Kilo, too, seemed to sense the separation, watching Alejandro leave with eyes that held a quiet understanding. One evening, Alejandro spoke with a shelter worker who shared more about Kilo's story. "He's not just lost, he was abandoned," she told him, a truth that hit Alejandro harder than he expected. Knowing that Kilo had been left behind by someone he trusted resonated with Alejandro on a deeply personal level. It brought back memories of his own struggle with loneliness and the feeling of being left to face life alone. For Alejandro, the discovery explained Kilo's behavior, the way he seemed to latch on to any hint of kindness and seek companionship as if it were his only anchor. In many ways, Kilo's story mirrored Alejandro's own pain, the sense of abandonment he'd wrestled with after his wife's death. Though it was hard to admit, Alejandro began to see how much he and Kilo shared. As days passed, Alejandro grew more torn. Each time he left Kilo at the shelter, he questioned whether it was truly best for the dog. While he wanted Kilo to have the best possible care and a good home, he couldn't deny the emptiness he felt every time they parted. Alejandro had once thought he was saving Kilo, but now it seemed that Kilo was saving him, offering a companionship he hadn't realized he longed for. Over time, the decision to leave Kilo at the shelter grew more difficult. Alejandro knew that Kilo deserved stability and a loving home, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that they belonged together. Kilo had brought a light to Alejandro's life that had long been missing, and each day apart made it clearer that Alejandro didn't want to imagine a future without the little dog by his side. Despite leaving Kilo at the shelter after each shift, Alejandro's connection to him continued to deepen. Whenever Alejandro arrived at the shelter to visit, Kilo would bound over, tail wagging with a joy that was infectious. It was as though, for those moments, the world outside disappeared, and all that mattered was the bond they shared. Kilo's excitement each time Alejandro returned made him feel like he was coming home to family. In a way, Kilo provided Alejandro with a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in years. Each visit to the shelter became more than just an act of responsibility, it became a source of genuine happiness. He often found himself counting the hours until he could see Kilo again, realizing how much he cherished those simple moments together. As time went by, Alejandro's colleagues at the station noticed the bond that had formed between the two. They'd tease him playfully, saying things like, "Looks like Kilo's already got you wrapped around his paw," or, "When are you bringing him home for good, Alejandro?" Though he would brush it off, deep down, he knew they were right. Kilo had become much more than a stray in need of a home. Every day Alejandro found it harder to leave Kilo behind, feeling an ache that reminded him of his own loss. The attachment had grown from concern for a lost puppy to a true friendship and companionship that he didn't want to let go. More and more, Alejandro thought about how much his life had changed since Kilo had entered it and how much emptier it would feel without him. One evening, as Alejandro patted Kilo's head before heading out of the shelter, he lingered a bit longer, feeling a deep sense of conflict. Kilo nuzzled his hand, sensing Alejandro's hesitation, and looked up with his big, trusting eyes. Alejandro knew then that a decision was inevitable, either he had to let Kilo go or embrace the companionship he brought fully into his life. The days passed, and Alejandro's inner conflict only grew stronger. He found himself lying awake at night, thinking about Kilo and how much joy the little dog had brought him in such a short time. Finally, after weeks of hesitation, Alejandro made a decision: he would adopt Kilo and give him a permanent home. For the first time in years, Alejandro felt a rush of excitement and anticipation. The morning of his decision, Alejandro got ready for work with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. "Today's the day," he told himself as he straightened his uniform. He planned to go to the shelter as soon as his shift ended, hoping that this choice would be a step toward filling the emptiness in his life. Kilo, he believed, was the missing piece that could bring warmth and comfort back into his home. His colleagues noticed his nervous energy throughout the day and quickly guessed his plan. Martinez, the veteran officer, gave him a supportive pat on the back. "Taking Kilo home, aren't you?" he asked knowingly. Alejandro just smiled, a bit embarrassed, but didn't deny it. The encouragement from his friends only solidified his decision. Kilo was about to become a permanent part of his life. The hours of his shift felt longer than usual, with each glance at the clock adding to his impatience. Finally, when the end of the day came, Alejandro didn't waste a moment. He rushed to the shelter, feeling both nervous and eager. The shelter staff greeted him with knowing smiles, already aware of his plan. They had seen the bond between Alejandro and Kilo grow and were genuinely happy that the little dog had found a devoted home. When Alejandro finally saw Kilo, the puppy's reaction left no doubt about the rightness of his decision. Kilo leapt into his arms, tail wagging with pure joy, as if he somehow understood that he was finally going home for good. Alejandro filled out the adoption papers with a sense of relief and joy, knowing that Kilo was now his in every sense. Together, they left the shelter, ready to begin a new chapter. In the following weeks, Alejandro and Kilo settled into a comfortable routine. Kilo quickly adapted to his new home, enjoying every bit of attention Alejandro showered on him. Yet, Alejandro began to notice something odd. Almost every day, Kilo would slip away through the backyard and disappear for hours at a time, only to return exhausted but calm. At first, Alejandro thought Kilo was just exploring, as dogs often do. But these outings were different. Kilo seemed to leave with a specific purpose, moving quickly as if he had a destination in mind. The pattern was unusual enough to worry Alejandro, and one evening, he decided to follow Kilo, curious to find out where the little dog went during these mysterious disappearances. Kilo moved with surprising determination, weaving through streets and alleys Alejandro knew well from his patrols. Each turn and street brought a new level of curiosity, as Kilo never stopped to sniff or linger. He was focused, leading Alejandro through areas he had patrolled countless times. Alejandro began to realize that Kilo's destination wasn't random, he had a purpose, one that Alejandro couldn't yet understand. After nearly half an hour of following, Alejandro watched in surprise as Kilo stopped in front of an old, abandoned house. The place was in disrepair, with broken windows and overgrown weeds. Kilo slipped through a gap in the fence, disappearing inside the crumbling structure. Alejandro, his heart racing, cautiously followed, wondering what had brought Kilo here. Once inside, Alejandro noticed a faint sound coming from the basement. It was a soft whimper, almost like someone crying. As he carefully descended the stairs, Alejandro felt a chill. In the dim light, he saw a young boy tied up, his face pale and gaunt. And there, beside the boy, Kilo wagged his tail gently, as if he had finally found what he'd been looking for all along. Alejandro's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. He rushed to the boy's side, recognizing him as Vicente, a missing child whose case he had been investigating. Vicente was weak but conscious, and as Alejandro gently untied him, he noticed the look of gratitude in the boy's eyes. Kilo, meanwhile, stayed close to Vicente, watching over him with a loyalty that amazed Alejandro. In a trembling voice, Vicente explained that he had been taken by someone he thought was a friend, only to be abandoned in this desolate place. "But Kilo, he came for me," Vicente whispered, his voice breaking. Alejandro looked at Kilo, astonished. He now understood why Kilo had disappeared every day. It was as if the little dog had been tirelessly searching for his young friend, following some inner compass of loyalty. The realization hit Alejandro like a tidal wave. Kilo wasn't just a stray he had rescued, he was a hero who had been on a mission all along. The dog had led Alejandro to Vicente, reuniting them in a moment of hope amidst the darkness. Alejandro felt overwhelmed with emotion, deeply moved by the strength and devotion Kilo had shown in his silent, unwavering search for his friend. Alejandro quickly called for backup, and within minutes, the police arrived to secure the scene and ensure Vicente received medical care. The officers were as astonished as Alejandro by Kilo's incredible instinct and dedication. While Vicente was taken to the hospital, Kilo never left his side, keeping a watchful eye on his young friend, as if ensuring that he was truly safe at last. That night, Alejandro felt a profound gratitude for Kilo, who had not only saved Vicente but had also reminded him of the strength of loyalty and love. Kilo had not just found a lost friend, he had reignited Alejandro's faith in the power of connection, showing him that the bonds we form can be life-changing and deeply healing. With Vicente now safe, Alejandro made a point of visiting him in the hospital daily. Vicente, still recovering, found comfort in Kilo's constant presence. Alejandro realized that the boy's trauma ran deep, and he knew that having a familiar friend like Kilo close by was crucial for his healing. As the days passed, a bond began to form among the three of them, creating an unexpected but loving trio. Alejandro had once considered himself someone who lived only for his job, accepting loneliness as part of his life. But now, his days were filled with moments spent with Vicente and Kilo. He found himself caring for Vicente as if he were family, guiding him through the process of recovery and helping him feel safe again. Kilo, too, seemed to feel at ease, as if he'd found his own purpose in reuniting with Vicente. The hospital staff and police station quickly became aware of the special connection between them. Officers who had known Alejandro for years commented on the transformation they saw in him. The once solitary officer now seemed to carry a warmth and joy that had been absent for so long. Kilo, often referred to as the hero dog, became a symbol of hope and loyalty for everyone who heard his story. One evening, as Alejandro watched Vicente petting Kilo with a gentle smile, he realized how much his own life had changed. Through the simple acts of rescuing a dog and later saving a child, Alejandro had found a new meaning to his own life. He knew now that Kilo wasn't just a dog, he was family, a friend, and a healer who had brought love and purpose back into his world. Slowly, Alejandro began to contemplate the idea of making this trio a permanent family. He wanted Vicente to know that he would always have a place to call home and someone who cared for him. The thought of adopting Vicente became a source of hope for Alejandro, one that filled him with purpose as he looked toward the future. The days turned into weeks, and Alejandro knew he wanted to take the next step. He began the process of legally adopting Vicente, determined to provide him with the stability and love he deserved. For the first time in years, Alejandro's home felt warm and alive, filled with the laughter and companionship he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Alejandro, Vicente, and Kilo soon settled into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. Every evening, Alejandro would pick Vicente up from school, with Kilo excitedly greeting him at the door. The trio would take walks in the park, where Vicente would throw a ball for Kilo, filling the air with laughter and joy. In those moments, Alejandro felt that his life had finally found the peace he had longed for. As their bond deepened, Alejandro's colleagues continued to notice the positive changes in him. His once quiet and reserved demeanor now held a warmth and openness that they hadn't seen before. Many remarked that Alejandro was no longer just an officer, he was now a devoted father figure and the proud owner of a hero dog who had transformed his life in ways no one could have predicted. Finally, the adoption papers were completed, and Vicente officially became part of Alejandro's family. It was a quiet moment, but one filled with immense meaning. Alejandro, who had once felt so lost, had found his way back to a life full of love and purpose, thanks to a chance encounter with a small, injured puppy on an empty street. As they returned home, Alejandro watched as Kilo curled up beside Vicente on the couch, both of them content and at peace. He knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together as a family. The loneliness that had once haunted him was now a distant memory, replaced by a life full of gratitude, hope, and love. Alejandro, Vicente, and Kilo had found one another, and together, they had created a new beginning. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.